At the moment, as we're seen as one of the few countries with a growing economy. New Zealand's GDP growth is expected to average around about 3% over the next 5 years. Employment is increasing and wages are rising faster than inflation. At the same time, we're benefiting from an extended period of low interest rates, and the government is working its way towards a surplus and repayment of debt. So we have a story that people are genuinely interested in. Our focus this term is to continue to deliver further steady reforms that deliver better results for all New Zealanders. One area we are concentrating on is housing, which will be the focus of my first speech of the year in Auckland tomorrow. Nick Smith's speech last week showed the government's commitment to reforming the Resource Management Act to increase land supply, reduce red tape and make housing more affordable. I'm going to talk about another important aspect of housing policy, which is social housing. Quite a lot has changed in this area over the last couple of years because our focus has been on getting a more diverse and fairer social housing system that works better for tenants. So MSD, rather than Housing New Zealand, now assesses whether people need social housing. Importantly, we've made it so you don't have to live in a state house to get income-related rent subsidies, which is the greatest level of housing support the government actually provides. People with high housing needs can get the subsidy if they live in a property run by an approved community housing provider, and they've been referred there by the Ministries for Social Development. We've also introduced reviewable tenancies so we can encourage and support people to move out of social housing if and when their circumstances change and other accommodation is available. We're taking these new approaches in social housing because we don't think the old system worked as well as it could do for tenants or indeed for taxpayers. And they fit into our wider approach to delivering better services to vulnerable New Zealanders who need government support. Tomorrow will be about setting out next steps in this social housing program. Just looking to the rest of the week, on Thursday I'll be in Auckland and Friday I'll be visiting Rotorua. The following week, as is the tradition, the National Party will be holding its full-day caucus at Premier House on Tuesday. I'll be heading to Waitangi at the end of the week.
Prime Minister, will you give details tomorrow of state housing stock that is going to be sold?
Yeah, we're broadly giving you an indication of what we think the makeup of social housing will look like and the sort of broad mix between new housing providers and Housing New Zealand.
So will you give some numbers tomorrow on how many houses the government intends to sell?
Yeah, I think you'll have a better indication of what that program looks like and what those numbers might look like over the course of the next few years.
And are we talking thousands of houses being sold?
I think it'd be better to wait tomorrow, but the overall focus here is to accommodate more New Zealanders in social housing. So we know there's a need, we know that at the moment the primary provider has been Housing New Zealand, and the very clear message from the government is we want to provide more houses to New Zealanders. How do we do that without the government deploying more and more of its balance sheet? And we think that by using community housing providers in a more targeted way, we can accommodate more vulnerable New Zealanders. So that will require a change in the balance sheet, but we'll get a sense of that tomorrow.
Will the overall number of houses under social housing increase or decrease according to your policy, no matter who the owner is?
The overall number will increase.
So houses will go on the block tomorrow?
Well, more New Zealanders will be accommodated in social houses.
But houses will be sold?
But more people will be accommodated in social houses.
How concerned are you about the Auckland housing market? The signs are heading back to 10% annual inflation growth in that market. We've got a mortgage war with interest rates getting down to levels we haven't seen since the global financial crisis. That's going directly against what you're trying to do. I mean, how concerned are you?
Well, there's a couple of things happening there, isn't there? I mean, for a start off, there's clearly renewed confidence in the economy, and I think you can see and feel that New Zealanders, and particularly those living in Auckland, are feeling better about the economy and more interested in buying a house. Secondly, those low interest rates, which are now much more likely to continue for longer, are encouraging people to get into the housing market. What the government is seeing, like everybody else in Auckland, is a lot more activity. More houses being built, a lot more land being released. But yes, we want to make sure that Auckland doesn't turn into a housing bubble that has a big impact on the rest of New Zealand. And the way to do that is to deliver more stock.
That won't work in the short term though, will it? I mean,
well, you saw more housing, more land released, I think, in the last 9 months of last year than did in the 9 years prior to that. The economic building activity, and the housing construction activity in Auckland is rising very, very rapidly. So I think you can see a lot more supply coming on, and you will in fact see more supply.
But the Reserve Bank can't really hike interest rates to deal with that problem because there's no inflation. So a number of economists are suggesting they are going to have to turn to more other tools to try and deal with Auckland. Are you comfortable if they have to do that?
Well, I'm not aware of any new ones that they're proposing at this point. I mean, we saw them have, LVR ratios as one idea. I can't rule out that they won't come to the Minister of Finance with other alternatives or other ideas. And if they do, then we'll go through the same process we did last time, which is consider the merits of those. But we haven't seen any of those yet.
But on the numbers of what you see in Auckland, with the way it is heading, do you think that those types of measures are warranted?
Well, I think the first and most important thing that we can do is ensure the fast release of land and the maximum amount of resources available to build properties. And there's no question we are seeing that. So this is not a new issue in terms of Auckland, but the approach that we've been taking as a government is new, and it actually is working. But you're right, that very low interest rates and the continuation of those low interest rates is likely to spark demand. To a certain degree, migration has some impact on that, so there's some elements there. I mean, overall, these aren't new issues for us to contend with. They are a sign of confidence in our economy. So rather than probably lament all of that or try and magic it away, I think we are a lot better to say what can we do to fix the situation. Let's build a lot more houses. You're certainly seeing that happening in Auckland.
Doesn't it
concern you though that house prices are rising much, much faster than wages?
I think in Auckland that's the case, that they are rising faster, and that does concern the government, and that's why we've had so many special housing areas now announced in Auckland. Like if we look at the number that we've announced, the bulk of them have been in Auckland. But if you take somewhere like Hobsonville, which is what was in my electorate, it's just moved out of it, that is the largest single housing development in Australasia. So it's not like there aren't a lot of houses being built in Auckland. I mean, the interesting question, last week, as I said from the media I was following from Davos, there was an interesting debate about whether house prices were going to collapse in Auckland by up to 25%. So I'm not suggesting that's going to be the case. I'm saying there's lots of interested parties.
I'm saying that is going to happen in 5 years' time. What we're dealing with here is a short-term problem of a demand problem in Auckland that could potentially cause a financial stability issue in New Zealand. So what can the government do to help the Reserve Bank?
I don't think it's going to cause a financial stability issue. I think what you have got is you've got a buoyant New Zealand economy, you've got low interest rates in Auckland, and you've got people wanting to buy properties, no question about that. But equally what you've got is building consents at much higher levels than we've seen them for a very long period of time, and a lot of activity to build new houses. And I think in the end, this is, there's two sides to this equation, demand and supply, and in my view, the way to resolve it is through supply.
So Auckland being in the top 10 cities in the world in terms of the most expensive housing, is that, to your mind, is that a crisis?
Well, it's definitely not a crisis, and also I think you've got to be a little bit careful. There is one survey, so that's Demographia, and Demographia don't use interest rates as a measure around affordability. So if you look at Roost or the Massey surveys, they do consider those, and they give you quite a different picture. So, in the end, it's a pretty simple issue, isn't it? It's, how many new houses are coming into supply versus how many people are demanding those houses. And all the government can do is what it is doing, which is make it a lot easier to build houses. Go and have a look at how much activity is taking place in Auckland. The answer is a hell of a lot, and it's as a result of those special housing areas. And it argues the case why we need permanent reform to the Resource Management Act, and we need to continue to increase that supply.
So you're doing nothing to curb demand in the short term?
Well, the demand side of the equation has always been the preserve, really, of the Reserve Bank.
We could do immigration.
Yeah, but to a certain degree, what's changed in New Zealand has been around the number of people leaving, not around the net number of people coming in, and quite a lot of those people who are coming in are actually helping solve the issue. So if you want to close off, for instance, people coming to New Zealand, you'll be closing off a lot of the Irish builders that are part of the solution, not part of the problem.
We got some inflation figures out last week showing very low inflation, potentially deflation. Is that going to make it harder for the government to get to its surplus this year?
It's one of the factors that affects the surplus. because effectively very low inflation affects the government's revenue. So in so much that it has a slight negative impact on the revenue numbers, and you saw that reflected in the DFU, it's a really good news story for the rest of New Zealand.
Are
So
you going to stick
if,
to your
if
target of getting to a surplus?
we are, and the Minister of Finance's view is, still remains that we can get there. But my point would be, if at the margin it knocks around the government revenue a little bit, but it's good for New Zealanders, I'd much rather have that scenario than the other way around.
So you'd accept a deficit given that it's caused by low inflation?
That's not the government's intention, it's to meet the surplus target, and that's what we'll be aiming to do. But you are talking about a very, very finely balanced number on the back of a $220 billion economy. But as we know, inflation is fundamentally poor for New Zealanders. It erodes their savings and it forces up interest rates.
So would you be happy
The
for
counter-argument to that, of course, is what we currently have, which is real wage growth, low levels of inflation and low levels of interest rates. That's actually good for New Zealanders.
What do you intend to do about the Mike Stephen police investigation? Do you expect him to stand up on the committee or as an MP?
I just don't have any comments to make at this time.
When did you find out about it?
I don't have any comments to make at this time. If I have something to say, I will, but I don't at this point.
Why your MPs are openly speculating about a by-election? You don't expect one?
I don't have any comments to make
Is that because there's a police
because I don't.
Is that because there's a police investigation underway?
I don't have any comments to make.
Just on ISIS,
Yep.
what did the other leaders put pressure on you to join the forces against it?
No, but what we did do in talking to other leaders was get an opportunity to exchange views on what they are thinking of doing. And there's quite a big range out there. But what there is a uniformity of view is that countries need to do something to stand up to ISIS. And I think we can see from the despicable acts of the Japanese hostages right through to the other brutality that has been administered by ISIS, that they are a great and worrying force. These people are a death cult, and countries do need to do something to stop them. But every country is going to take a different view, and as I said in my speech in November, we will make decisions on what we think are in the best interests of New Zealanders. One of those options might be to train some Iraqi forces, and that's something that we're actively exploring at the moment.
So if we do contribute, should New Zealand brace for some kind of retaliation?
I don't think so, but my point would be that we're not going to have, if you're a believer, as I am, in an independent foreign policy, I'm not going to not take steps because of threats from a terrorist group. Otherwise, by definition, you don't have independent foreign policy. You have foreign policy determined by a bunch of terrorists, and actually that isn't going to keep the world or New Zealand any safer. I mean, in fact, actually standing up to ISIS and reducing their threat, in my view, makes it a safer world for New Zealanders.
Given what we saw with the Japanese hostages, though, that was retaliation according to IS.
I think IS will always try and claim those things, just as they have claimed them with others. That might be a convenient excuse that they use, and they use a great many. Wouldn't take too much out of their comments.
After speaking to other leaders, are you leaning more towards sending troops over there?
No, I think I'm in the same position I was late last year, which is I don't think New Zealand should be fighting Iraq's war for Iraq. I think in the end, the best way through all of this is actually the Abadi government making decisions which demonstrate to their people that they're inclusive and that they will encourage and encompass the views of all the three parties over there, the Kurds, the Shiites and the Sunnis. But ultimately they may need some support in making sure that they can defend that position, and that may involve some training, and I think that's a credible thing we can do. We're not going to send air capability, we don't have, in the form of an airstrike capability, we don't have that. There's many other things I don't think are right, but we might possibly be able to add that area. That's something that we've got Defence looking at.
You have in the past said that there is some risk of retaliation. Yep. Why are you now saying there isn't much of a risk?
Well, I'm just saying that I don't think that position actually changes.
And what did you mean when you told the BBC that there has to be some contribution, that that's the price of the club? What do you mean by that?
Well, my point there is that there's collective responsibility, and in the end, we run an independent foreign policy. We make our own decisions. But actually, I do think that no one single nation is going to defeat ISIS or any other terrorist group that's out there. But collectively, we can work. And that's not just the United States and the United Kingdom. That's the position held by the Netherlands and by Turkey and by Sweden, by a great many other countries.
Is that reason enough to join the fight against Islamic State?
I think it's reason enough that all countries who are like-minded would be of a view to try and do something, because I don't think it's actually physically feasible or possible for one country to solely take that view. And my view is that New Zealanders are prolific travellers. We have lots of people in that region. Experience shows us that whenever there are significant terrorist threats, there's a high probability that a New Zealander will be a casualty as a result of that. So in the end, should New Zealand play some small part to stand up against ISIS? I think on balance of probabilities the answer to that is yes, but I think that's true for pretty much most countries that are of a like mind, and I think that they will.
Prime Minister, on tomorrow's speech, previously it's been said about a third or 22,000 of the state houses are in the wrong place or the wrong size. Could we see that many being sold? Could we see 22,000 or 20,000 houses being sold?
No.
Be
You
less than
said
that.
that after whatever happens, there'll be more social housing.
Yeah.
Is that because you've got guarantees from those other social housing providers that they will provide more?
Well, ultimately the way we provide that social housing is the number of people that have the opportunity to essentially benefit from an income-related rent. And evidence shows us that when we've broadened that criteria, or that eligibility out from just Housing New Zealand, that does bring other interested players in. So certainly the Minister of Social Housing and the Minister of Finance have had extended conversations with a range of different providers, and they have certainly indicated they're under the right conditions their interest. So I think, in a way, I think the way to think about this issue at the moment is, in a world where only Housing New Zealand could provide an income-related rent, it was a world that said the only way to build more New Zealanders, or build better access for New Zealanders, was effectively for Housing New Zealand to either lease or buy more, build more houses. And I think that's a very narrow window of opportunity for people. So I actually think Housing New Zealand does have a lot of stock that's either in the wrong place or the wrong configuration. To give you one example, about 30% I think of the demand for Housing New Zealand homes is actually for single bedroom homes, but only 9% of the stock's in that case. So we need to think more creatively, because right at the moment what we've got is a system that's locking out a whole lot of people in need. It's locking in a whole lot of people who could otherwise move and won't, and we're configuring our stock in the wrong order and in the wrong place. And I think the test won't be how many houses Housing New Zealand own vis-a-vis Salvation Army or somebody else. The test will be, are we providing more accommodation to families in need? If we can meet that test and do better, then I think overall New Zealanders will support it.
Is the government prepared to sell some of that housing stock to community providers at a discount or at cost, in terms of just getting them into the game?
Potentially, and we've already done a bit of that, because you can see that I think it was last year we established the Social Housing Fund with about $100 million, and that provided some capacity for those social housing providers to get in there. And there might be a very good reason why we want that, because, for instance, some of those social housing providers are providing lots of services to those particular clients, and they may be better placed actually to look after all of the affairs of that family, as opposed to just MSD, which might be providing just one service.
Are you
Have you-
open
And if
to
you do
selling
sell-
some of those state houses to private landlords rather than community groups?
Well, that has happened, because we've sold about 1,000 houses, I think, last year, and there's been a range of different buyers there. So again, it might be something that's possible if those resources are, depending on how they're deployed and where they're used. But again, you could have some houses either in locations that don't make sense for them to be there, or in completely the wrong location, and that just frees up resources to do something else with.
But the bulk of them are going to iwi and community groups.
That would be probably my expectation. But it also can be reconfiguration. I mean, you've seen a number of stories in that regard. But for instance, it might be that there's a group of state houses in a particular area, and they could be knocked over. a group of affordable homes and social houses could be erected in that area, a great many more, and in different configurations, but potentially with different owners of those. So it's a more sophisticated way of dealing with the problem.
And if you do end up selling thousands of houses, would you describe that as an asset sale? Would you view that?
It's definitely not. Selling individual state houses, almost no matter what number, is not an asset sale, as we know. Meridian, under the previous Labor government, sold Southern Hydro, and that was about 15% of their balance sheet. And I don't recall Trevor Mallard at the time referring to that as an asset sale.
Did you discuss that bank compensation today?
We had a discussion about that issue in relation to David Bain. So as you saw last